Hello. This is going to be the first lecture that I give this week via video. Don't forget, Wednesday night, 99 Restaurant over in Sharonville. I've made an announcement about that. So we'll be meeting there for dinner. But today's video lecture is going to be on population control and particularly how the one-child policy was implemented and then went on to affect a generation of women who have sometimes been referred to as China's baby boom generation because many of them were born in the 1950s or 1960s. They were part of this population explosion that preceded the one-child policy. And other times they're referred to as the unhappy generation because they were born into the socialist system knowing nothing else than but Maoist promises of women's liberation from the household, their opportunities for political careers or to engage in professions not permitted their mothers. But this generation experienced many of the climactic moments of the 20th century. They, in their most impressionable years, experienced the Great Leap Forward and famine, and then in their teens and 20s became Red Guards and experienced the throes of that revolution. And then the equally troubling shift from Maoist principles to the more open market economy in the 1980s. But most importantly, they experienced kind of during their prime years as women in their 20s and 30s, the restrictions placed on them of family planning that demanded they sacrifice their ambitions for larger families or at least reduce them in service of the state and the country. Now, why is the one-child policy implemented in the 1980s? Well, it's because China becomes more and more aware of its population explosion that it experienced in the 1950s and 1960s, which during the Maoist era had been something that people had shied away from announcing publicly because of an ideological dispute between Mao and his loyalists, who look at the projections of Western demographers and economists that say China's population is going to explode and it's going to create all this problem because of the scarce resources there, that are echoed in part by a number of statisticians and economists and demographic experts in China. But those experts are on the wrong side of the 100 Flowers movement. And so Mao dismisses both the outside and the inside voices of professionals and experts and says this is a fallacy, it's propaganda, it's counter-revolutionary thought that's trying to undermine us. Our population size and its growth is a resource, and so they promote through propaganda people having more and more babies. This shifts with Deng Xiaoping, where we get the more result-based groups, and many of those people are rehabilitated, and people now take seriously the idea that population can be a drain on the resources. One, going back to a classic idea of states, the Malthusian trap, the idea that when your population grows to such an extent that resources such as food become more and more scarce, you're going to have some kind of event like a famine or disease or war or some kind of manufactured catastrophe such as a revolution that will then bring the population size back into equilibrium with resources. Okay? Well, added to that is the thought prominent among China's planners for the economy in the 1980s that basically whatever gains we make in productivity in agriculture or food production or in industry and the sciences, all these reforms that we're trying to make, well, a larger population will just eat those up so that they don't have a dramatic effect. They don't greatly increase living standards. Instead, those gains are just more and more dispersed along a large population. This is particularly true of food. So remember, Sichuan, we engineer great gains in agricultural productivity, but there's only so much land available in China. China, according to a 1982 census, shows now has over 1 billion people, which is 1/4 of the world's population. And yet, to feed that 1/4 of the world's population, only has 7% of the world's arable land that can be used effectively for agriculture. Another way to put this is China in territorial size is much, much larger than the United States, and yet only has half as much cultivated land, only half as much land that can be used to grow food. Some of this is man-made disasters, though. The 1950s and 60s, the emphasis on central planning and heavy industry leads to uncontrolled deforestation and a great deal of industrial pollution that kind of squanders some of China's natural gifts. Those effects are being felt in the 1970s and 1980s and only get worse in the 1990s to the present day. But in order to prevent population growth from eating away at the gains made through reform or creating some kind of catastrophe, we get the introduction of the one-child policy in two distinct phases, and this is really important. The first phase is announced by Hua Guofeng and the National People's Congress, and it's a voluntary phase where through propaganda and education, the state is trying to promote family planning, the use of contraceptives, and decisions made by families to limit the size of their family. So they want to restrict family size down to one child by promoting this is a great sacrifice and it's something done to show you're a good citizen. They want to promote later marriages, delay marriage to kind of slow population growth, and they want to space out children. Okay, which we're going to talk about is actually really, really effective during the voluntary phase. But one statistic gathered by China's planners that gives them great cause for concern is that even after this one-child policy is announced, there's 1.7 million births to families that are that have 5 children or even more. Okay, so China's largest families, even after this, decide to have more babies, and that gives the planners and the top leaders in Beijing great cause for concern. Okay, so that leads to a stricter policy where the state begins to enforce it. Okay, and the ways in which they enforce the one-child policy is they mandate that women, after having one child, have an intrauterine device surgically installed into their bodies. They have compulsory sterilization of husband or wife after the second child. And then the local leaders who are left to implement the one-child policy create a complex system of incentives. One-child families get privileges and education, better housing, these types of things, and then punishments. Primarily fines, which over the history of the one-child policy from the 1980s until 2015, when the party announced it was going to phase out the one-child policy and abandon it, over $300 billion US is collected by the state in terms of fines. Also, another form of punishment is for people who are found to have more children than they were allowed. They lose land, those private plots they've been given. They lose their jobs. Their children or themselves are denied social services or things such as education. One thing you might ask yourself is whether or not the rich or the elite would just simply pay these fines. But the state tries to restrict the ability of the wealthy to kind of bypass this or just purchase children, is one way to look at it, by making the fines adjusted to income. For instance, Zhang Yimou, the director of To Live, the film that we watched a little bit ago, very recently, I think it was like 5 or 10 years ago, had his third child, which was beyond his allowances, and he was forced to pay a massive fine of thousands, hundreds of thousands, I think even millions of dollars. A peasant or a factory worker is not going to pay that sum, but it is a great sum that they're going to have to pay. We see the one-child policy becomes incredibly controversial almost immediately after its adoption by the state. And controversial in two respects. One, because many groups such as NGOs, religious groups like Western Christianity and its institutions such as Protestant missionary forces or the Catholic Church, but also world leaders see this as a violation of human rights, in part because at times the one-child policy will be violently enforced through forced abortions at very late stage pregnancies that sometimes results in the deaths of the mothers. But it's also questionable about whether or not this system is effective, whether or not it actually is having much of an impact on China's population. And we'll circle back around to that argument too, that's mostly between scholars and state planners. But a third level of controversy and conflict with the state comes in terms of families, a lot of which takes place in the countryside, where especially farming or peasant families still look at children as a must-have. They're a form of security. They bring in extra income. This is actually increased when the state abandons the commune system and begins to pay people according to contract labor, while more children equals more contracts for a family and greater income. So it's a form of security. And especially with the decline of the guaranteed security that the state gives in terms of old age pension systems, which are still very limited in China, even under communism, then people say, well, children according to the old Confucian idea are how I retire. They're the people that take care of me in my life. Okay, we do see some modification in behaviors where people instead of gift giving for children begin to adapt and say, okay, when peasants are forced to abort a child or undergo sterilization, then they give gifts. So we see some remodeling of culture towards the new values. But we also see a modification of the state's approach and its policy. There's several revisions made that create for greater allowances. For instance, you see once it's implemented, the decision made that anyone whose first child is born with a disability, they will be allowed a second child. Then we see a number of provisions made that if your first child is born that's a girl, that then you will be allowed to have a second child in the hopes of having a son, placating the old Confucian tradition that a son carries on the line, and the hopes for the future of the family are mostly invested in males. Also, rural populations are allowed a second child after 5 years, so as long as they're spacing children properly, they can have a second child. And the rule is not, the one-child policy is not applied to ethnic minorities or underpopulated regions. So when we talk about the one-child policy, it ends up really by the 2000s only being applied to about 30 to 35% of the population. Mostly, the one-child policy is targeted at urban residents to try and keep them to having what we call the 4-2-1 family structure. 4 grandparents, 2 parents, and 1 child. Okay, so the legacy and results of the one-child policy. We do see declining fertility rates, and the official figures promoted by the Chinese Communist Party say that it probably prevented 400 million births. Some people have taken issue with that. Whether or not it actually did much to slow down China's population growth is debatable, because the most dramatic decline that we see comes during that first phase, the voluntary phase, where actually the births per family falls from about 6 children to around 2.5 or 3 by the late 1970s. From there, it's going to dip from about 2.5 to about 1.5. It's questionable, though, people say, whether or not this did much to slow down the birth rate, or it's just China's growing urbanization since the 1980s and increasing living standards, but also costs of things in society such as housing or healthcare that slows things down. Because throughout Asia, these factors like urbanization, we see fertility rates declining down to levels lower than even China's one-child policy in countries like South Korea, and the city-state of Singapore, Japan, and the Philippines. So what happens in China through this policy is largely similar to what happens in these areas without a similar policy in place. Does that make sense? Okay, so in part 2 of this video, I'm going to talk about how the one-child policy has impacted the lives of women, particularly a generation of women that we refer to as the baby boom generation of China, because they were born as part of this massive population growth in the 1950s and 1960s, but also sometimes referred to as the unhappy generation, because they are born into the socialist system. They know nothing else in terms of experience than what has been promised them by the Maoist state. That's greater liberation, and yet they live through many events that lead them to become very disillusioned and lead them to question how much their lives have changed in comparison to their mothers.